Patch 14.1 has been out for about a week now, and the meta has shifted from the previous patch from an AD heavy meta to an AP heavy meta. I'm going to show you my item slam tier list to help you climb in this patch. This tier list is based off a combination of data as well as my personal opinion. If you think an item should be in a different tier, feel free to let me know why. Alright, with that being said, here's the list. I'll be going over each tier and explain each item, and the timestamps will be in the description. So starting off, we have the Slam If You Can tier. Warmugs is first. So this item can be used on many different tanks. It's a generic tank item for your frontline units, so just put it on your frontline and you're good to go. Sentinels, Guardians, and Bruisers all love this item, and it just buys so much time for your team to be able to do damage and potentially win you the fight. It's also incredibly strong in the early game if you have an upgraded frontline unit, so you could push for a win streak if you have a Warmugs in the early game. Next, we have Adaptive Helm. What's interesting about this item is its flexibility. After its buffs in patch 14.1, it became an incredibly strong item. You can flex this item between a frontline unit or a backline unit. It's also quite good if you can't get a Shojin on your carry unit, as it still allows you to gain mana while also giving you slightly more AP than Shojin. Adaptive Helm is also great on carries that want mana but don't have a lot of attack speed, so units like Seraphine and Vex absolutely love this item. It's also great to make if you just can't get a Shojin, so right now, Adaptive Helm or Shojin are the two best items to slam on AP carries, so make an Adaptive Helm if you can. Next is Jeweled Gauntlet. So we're currently in an AP heavy meta, and the top AP carries are TF, Karthus, Ziggs, Vex, etc. And JG allows you to amplify this damage, just pretty much making it an incredibly good slam. And chances are, you'll probably be playing around one of these units in the late game anyway, so pretty much if you slam a JG, it's not going to go to waste. And early game casters like Nami, Annie, and Senna also love this item as well, so you can't go wrong with slamming JG on this patch. Next is Crown Guard. So Crown Guard is an extremely good slam early game because pretty much any frontline unit can use this item. Both the initial shield and AP it gives are very useful for frontline units that scale with AP. Units such as Mordekaiser and Blitz absolutely love this item. It serves as a tank and AP item at once, so even if you put it on a tank unit that doesn't really care about AP, the 30% max HP shield is extremely good for buying your backline time, so this item is very good. And also, if you're playing a comp that doesn't use AP, this item is incredibly good for killing a rod. So things like country comp, if you're not playing around Vex items, you can slam it on your Thresh or something, it's extremely good. So next we have Red Buff. So despite its nerfs in patch 14.1, it actually doesn't really matter, this item is still the same. You build this item for the attack speed as well as the anti-heal. I think the damage buff is certainly nice, and the nerf it received was nowhere near enough to make this item bad. Red Buff could also be used on pretty much any carries, so it's extremely flexible. If you're looking to kill bows, you can always make Red Buff. It gives you anti-heal. It's just an item that could basically be used on pretty much anybody. Next is Ionic Spark. So after its change in patch 14.1, it now gives you 200 extra HP on your units, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's actually pretty scary in the early game. If you have an upgraded tank in the early game, you could just place this item on them and watch your team run over the enemy team. 200 HP might not seem like a lot, but you have to keep in mind this is the equivalent of Cybernetic Bulk 1, so it's absolutely free. They buff this item. Slam it on your early game tank if you're playing around AP, it is very good. Especially since we're now in an AP heavy meta, Spark has just gone up in priority, so build this item if you can. Next is Shojin. So Shojin is a pretty easy one to explain here. Pretty much all the carries in this meta want Shojin. This item allows them to cast more often, basically allowing you to enable that champion. Units like Twisted Fate and Karthus depend on this item, so if you don't have Shojin on it, they absolutely suck. But as I said earlier, you can make Adaptive Helm. It's just as good as Shojin on pretty much every single unit. There is the attack speed argument, but honestly, if you slam an Adaptive Helm early game, it's going to save you HP. So either Shojin or Adaptive Helm, very good mana generation items in this meta. I think what makes Shojin extremely powerful right now is just the ability to be flexed between multiple different champions right now. Pretty much almost every single carry wants Shojin, so if you slam this item, it's hard to find a user that you can't put it on. Next item we have is Bloodthirster. So BT is a great slam in this patch because a lot of melee fighters are quite good. Examples are Yone, Riven, Zed, Akali, Viego. So if you find yourself leaning into one of these comps, then you will pretty much always want BT on them, because if you don't, they're just gonna get bursted down. If you aren't playing any of these units, then you could put a BT on 5-cost units like Yorick, Kiana, Kayn. So it's just a very good Omnivep item that you could put on your units. It also got a small AP buff, so it's actually a little bit better on units like Kayn. But yeah, BT, very good slam in this meta. So next is Sunfire. So Sunfire has always been a good early game slam due to the true damage it does in the early game, as well as preventing enemies from healing up as much. Anti-heal is incredibly important in the late game as well, so you can't go wrong with slamming Sunfire. While Sunfire isn't necessarily a tank item, it allows you to save HP in the early game, so making this item has a lot of value. Next is Morello. So similar to Sunfire, anti-heal is quite important to have in the late game. Another interesting thing about Morello is its ability to be played on a carry. The reason for this is because the item gained 15% attack speed in patch 14.1, so you could think of it as having red buff on your carry, but it leans more towards having AP instead of attack speed. This is a great item to use for anti-heal on units that can attack multiple enemies at once. So things like Seraphine, Twisted Fate, and Ziggs really love this item. So the last item in this tier is Dragon's Claw. So once again, since we're in an AP heavy meta, Dragon's Claw is going to be very good against AP. It also gives your tanks more HP, and it also helps them heal up, making it a very good item to buy time for your backline. It's stronger on bruiser units since they gain max HP from it, as well as the healing scales off of max HP, but Sentinels and Guardians can use this item just fine. Slam Dragon's Claw if you get it, it's very good. So next on the tier list we have the you will probably use this late game tier. The items in this tier are fine to slam, but are either not as flexible or might not be as strong in the early game. So first we have Steadfast Heart. So Steadfast Heart is a good item, but you might want to save the glove for a damage item like Infinity Edge or Joe's Gauntlet. It is by no means a bad item, but sometimes you want to give the glove for an offensive item. Otherwise, this item is quite strong in both the early and late game, so if you slam it, it's still gonna be good. Next is Blue Buff. Blue Buff received a small nerf in patch 14.1 just because so many units were able to use it last patch. It's still a good item, but the problem with it now is that the units that love this item in the previous patch are just not as favored in this meta. Examples are Ahri got nerfed, Ezreal is just not as good as he was in the previous patch, and Jhin is suffering like there's no tomorrow. So you'd also prefer to use the tiers on items like Adaptive Helm and Shojin, so blue buff is less of a priority now. But if you make this item, it's still very good. It's just that you prefer to make other items in this current meta. Next item is Even Shroud. So Even Shroud is a very interesting item. So while we aren't in an AD heavy meta anymore, the initial resistances this item gives at the start of the fight is quite good for your tank. In addition to that, the Sunder it provides is actually pretty useful in pretty much any team composition. And the reason for this is because all champions auto attack and they all deal physical damage. So even if you aren't playing an AD comp, you aren't necessarily ever wasting the Even Shroud value. And once again, since we're not in an AD favored meta, Even Shroud is not a priority to slam, but it's still a useful item if you splash in some AD unit in the late game or whatever. So this item could be slammed to win streak if you're trying to play around AD. Otherwise, don't slam it if you're trying to play AP. But if you somehow just have a random Even Shroud while you're playing AP, it's not the end of the world. Next is Protector's Vow. Vow is an incredibly good item on tanks that want to cast faster, so units like Thresh and Zac love this item. It's not the best in the early game though because it scales off of max HP, but I would say it's still an okay slam. The only thing holding this back from being an instant slam, in my opinion, is how important tier is right now for AP units. Otherwise, I believe this item is extremely good. If you find a Protector's Vow on the carousel in the late game, I would recommend picking it up and putting it on tank CC units like Thresh or Zac. You can also put it on Alawi, she really loves this item. So yeah, that's Protector's Vow. So next we have Hodge. So Hodge is a flexible item, but it's not very good in the early game. It doesn't provide the best stats to your units until the later stages of the game. This item becomes a lot stronger if you pair it with crit, so things like IE and JG, as well as Executioners or Jeweled Lotus. I wouldn't slam this item, but if you do end up slamming it, you could put it on pretty much any tier unit. What's interesting about this item is I've seen people put it on their backline units like Twisted Fate to heal back up from things like Karthus and Akali, and it seems to be quite good. So maybe Hodge it could be good in this meta, who knows, maybe people haven't caught on yet. But if you slam this item, I think it's still fine, but you want to save the tier for other things like Shojin or Adaptive Helm. Next is Archangels. Archangels got a buff in 14.1, giving it 5 more AP every time it procs. In my opinion, it's a very good item, but it's not favored in this meta as well, so it's kind of a weird item. There are a lot of comps that like to end fights very quickly, so things like Executioners. And if you can't get full value out of Archangels, then it's not a very good item. Also, once again, you want to save the tier for other items like Shojin or Adaptive Helm. So, in my opinion, Archangels shouldn't be slammed right away. But if you do slam it and you're gonna play around AP, then I think it's completely fine. Next, we have Nashers. So Nashers is a strong item, but I don't think it's very good in the early game. It also requires you to cast to gain most of its benefits, so if you don't have a mono generation item, for example, then you could take forever to get your Nashor's Tooth value. If you have something like Adaptive Helm or Shojin with Nashor's together, this item is very strong, but in the early game, this item is not very good. But this item is very strong in the late game on a triple item damage unit. Slam this item if you know you're going to play around it, but otherwise, I would avoid making it in the early game. Pretty much any AP caster can use this item, and units with higher mana pools don't like this item as much, but it's still definitely usable. Next is Deathcap. Deathcap got changed to be more of a damage item instead of an AP item in patch 14.1. It's actually not the worst, as 20% damage amp is pretty much just Giant Slayer, just 5% less. Slap this item on units that love burst damage, such as Lux, Vex, or Karthus, Ziggs, anyone who likes to have damage amp. And then you can also think of this item as pretty much like a Giant Slayer now, with just a lot of AP. The reason why you probably don't want to instantly slam this item though is because Rod is more important for items like Spark, JG, and Crown Guard. So if you have a bunch of extra rods, then you could definitely slam this item. Otherwise, I would avoid slamming it. Next is Shiv. So Shiv is a fantastic item in the early game, but the reason why it's not an instant slam in this meta, in my opinion, is because the tier is too valuable. In this meta, you want to make Adaptive Helm or Shojin, like I said earlier, and killing a tier for that isn't ideal. But if you know you can win streak with a Shiv, then by all means go ahead and slam it. But you could also get Shred from Spark, so this item is not a priority in my opinion. Regardless, it's still a very good item. Next item is Titans. Titans can be used on pretty much any melee fighter. It's not an instant slam in my opinion, because sometimes you might not even end up playing these units. You usually pair this item with healing ones as well, so if you slam it on 2-1, it's probably not going to be very good, unless you get a healing augment or something. But otherwise, it's still a very good item. It's just not a instant slam in my opinion. Worst case, if you don't use this item, you could put it on a tank like Mordekaiser or Blitz. But yeah, that's pretty much Titans. And finally, the last item in this tier is IE. So Infinity Edge is a good crit item for units like Twitch and Samira. It's also good on AD units you're playing around in late game, like Ezreal. But once again, since we're no longer in an AD favored meta, I would only slam this item if you're looking to play around AD. But yeah, regardless, you could almost always put this item on a unit in the late game, regardless of your team comp. But I would say IE is not an instant slam because you would prefer to play AP in this meta. But if you get an AD opener, then slamming IE is not the worst. Alright, now we have the don't slam, but it's good in the late game tier. As the name suggests, it's items that you shouldn't generally slam in the early game at all, but these items can be good in the late game. First, we have Gunblade. So Gunblade is a great item to keep your front line alive, but this item generally suffers in the early game. The reason for this is because the Omni Vamp that it gives is not very good if you don't have a lot of damage. So It sucks in the early game, but if you have triple items in the later stages of the game, for example, triple item Ari, it's very good. But in the early game, I would pretty much just avoid making this item. Next is Bramble. Bramble is not the best in this meta since it's mostly just an armor item. The damage it does is okay in the early game, but you're better off building other chain items like Sunfire. If you're for some reason not facing an AP heavy lobby, which is pretty unlikely, then Bramble becomes a better item. This item becomes quite good in the late game, as it's a generic take item to reduce damage taken, but in my opinion it's not an instant slam, so once again, good in the late game, but not an instant slam. Next is Giant Slayer. GS is always a good item in the late game, as it helps you tear through the front line, but if you've been playing TFT for a while, then you know that GS has always been a bad slam in the early game, as it only buffs once you get the 1600 HP threshold. You can slam it if you know you can win streak, as this item is always good on any carry in the late game, but otherwise, just avoid slamming this item. Next, we have Guardbreaker. So Guardbreaker is similar to Giant Slayer. It should only be slammed if you know you can win streak. Otherwise, there aren't that many shields in the early game, and the damage amp probably won't do much for your unit in the early game anyway, but in the late game, it's extremely good. Belt is also a pretty important component in the early game for tank or anti-heal items, so Guardbreaker is not a priority to slam in the early game. Next is Sterix Gauge. So Sterix is a good item, but the problem with it is that it uses two very important components, Sword and Belt, which are both important components for other items. For example, if you're trying to play a melee carry and you're trying to make BT but you don't get two swords, you're probably just gonna make BT first, and you're not gonna make Sterix. Also, this item scales with max HP, so it's actually quite bad in the early game. It's also not the most flexible item, so you're better off just slamming other items. But this item is incredibly good on AD fighter units in the late game, especially if you manage to get them with things like BT, Hodge, or Titans. So make Sterix Gauge if you know you're going to play around it in the late game and you have extra swords or extra components. Otherwise, avoid slamming this item. Next, we have Redemption. So Redemption, while it's not a bad item, it's not favored in the early game, as well as tier being more important in this meta for other items like Shojin or Adaptive Helm. Belt is also important for making anti-heal items, so only slam Redemption if you know you can win streak. This item also forces you to clump to get value out of it, which is actually quite bad against units like Vex and Thresh, who are very prominent in the meta right now, so be careful when you're using this item. The last item in this tier is Thief's Gloves. So TG is an interesting item. It really depends if you want to slam it. TG doesn't roll good items in early games, so I personally don't slam it unless I'm doing something specific. If your comp doesn't care about gloves that much, you can make this item as well. But most importantly, if you have the augments Sleight of Hand or Lucky Gloves, then you want to try to make as many TGs as you can. I think for Sleight of Hand, 2 TGs is good enough, but for Lucky Gloves, you want to try to make as many as possible. And finally, we have the It Depends tier. First in this tier is Edge of Night. So Edge of Night is a niche item. It depends on the lobby. If you're fighting your carries being obliterated by things like Karthus, Akali, or random Lux, whatever, something just kills your backline right away, then you can make this item. Melee carries like Yasuo and Zed also love this item, but you should only make this item if you're going to play around them. Edge of Night is by no means a bad item, but sometimes you just don't need it. Next item is Rageblade. So in my opinion, Rageblade is a terrible item. You can make it and plant it to use it on units like Sona who love this item, but it's not an item many carries want to use. Twisted Fate can use it quite well, but other than that, it's a suboptimal item for pretty much every single carry. This meta is unfriendly against stall comps as well, so you're better off just making Nashor's Tooth if you want attack speed on your carry. Next is Last Whisper. When you should make this item really depends. If you already have an Even Shroud, then this item is redundant for the most part, but it's still okay to have both. I think it's more valuable to save the glove and bow for other items such as IE and GS, but if you know that you're going to definitely play around AD, then Last Whisper becomes better with crit as well, so you can combine this with IE, Executioners, or maybe something like Jeweled Lotus. You can also slam it to win streak if you know you could get a good AD opener, so this item, it just really depends. Next item is Stoneplate. So Stoneplate is a decent item, and it did receive a small buff. It now gives 100 additional HP. But this item uses 2 important components, Chain and Cloak. In addition, there aren't that many good solo frontliners to set, so yeah, I wouldn't recommend building this item. They also gutted this item really hard because of set 9.5 Taric, so this item is very low priority now. It's not a bad item, it's just you'd rather use the components on other defensive components. And one last thing about Stoneplate is that it absolutely sucks if your unit has no HP, so you pretty much just need other tank items for Stoneplate to become better, which is not something that's probably going to happen in the early game, so it's not a good early game item slam. Next item is Deathblade. So Deathblade is similar to Last Whisper. You only want to make this item if you know you're going to play around AD, but even then, you'd prefer to just put IE on your AD carries instead. This set has a lot of AD casters, so you want that spell to crit, and Deathblade doesn't do that. It's by no means a bad item, you just prefer not to eat 2 swords to make a Deathblade. Because you'd rather have IE and Giant Slayer. Deathblade just doesn't seem very good to build at the moment. And then the next item here is Hurricane. So Hurricane is similar to other AD items. You only want to build this if you're trying to do something specific. I would slam this item if you have an additional AD item, so something like Deathblade and Runads, but otherwise this item is not very good on its own. And you also want attack speed for this item as well, so yeah, Hurricane's not very good unless your unit meets these specific conditions. And also, once again, we are not in an AD favored meta, so Hurricane just becomes less valuable in this meta. But it's by no means a bad item, it's just something you want to avoid building if possible. And finally, in this tier, and the last item for this video, is Quicksilver. So QS is a niche item like Edge of Night. You want to put it on units where you want to avoid getting locked down from CC. Riven is a great user of this item, but pretty much if you're trying to play a melee carry, you want to put QS on them to bypass CC. But you should only make this item if you know you're going to play around a unit that is probably going to get CC'd. So usually it's a melee carry. Otherwise, you pretty much never want to slam this item. It doesn't do much in the early game. So that's my tier list for slammable items in patch 14.1. I've experimented with these items in the early game, and this is my read on them. Hopefully this information has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below, and I'll do my best to answer it. If you have a different opinion about an item, feel free to let me know as well. Good luck on your climb, and I'll see you later.